Okay, good morning everybody and welcome to week 6 of the learning series. My name is Darja and I'm joined here by Katherine. We're just going to turn our video on for a second to say hi so you can see us. So I'm Darja and I'm a project officer on the learning project for the Disasters and Emergencies Preparedness Programme.
And my name is Katherine Dunlop. I work for the Monitoring, Evaluation and Learning Services here at Action Against Hunger UK.
Great. And I'm just going to ask Petra, I'm going to turn off my video, ask Petra to introduce herself. Petra? Oh, I think.
Hello, my name is Petra Pojerovà. I'm working for Humanitarian Leadership Academy in London, and I will be presenting a presentation for you later on. Hi, everyone.
Are you guys happy to...
Perfect. Thank you, Petra. Great. So today we'll be talking about identifying and packaging learning.
Yeah.
And we're about halfway through the series. So for those of you who have joined us before, welcome back. And for those of us joining us for the first time, a big welcome to you too. So this is a 10-week series that's run by the Learning Project, which is part of the Disasters and Emergencies Preparedness Programme that's co-managed by the START and the CDAC networks. And we're hosted here at Action Against Hunger. The programme itself is made up of 14 projects and focuses on capacity building for local and national actors by investing in collaborative networks, and it takes place in 10 countries. So as I mentioned, we're about halfway through the series, and the previous webinars have covered a range of topics from case studies to humanitarian collaboration. If you've missed any of these, they're all available in the library on our learning platform website, which is disasterpreparedness.ngo/learning library. And we'll share the link in the chat. So before we begin, I just want to highlight a couple of things. To minimize distractions for our speakers, I'll be muting everyone as they come online, so please don't be offended. It's just standard protocol. If you have any technical issues with sound, if you can't hear us or you can't see the screen or anything, my colleague Alice will be on the chat, and she will appear as the Learning Project. So please just message her and she'll be happy to help you. Questions are very welcome, and we would encourage you to share them in the chat, which we'll be monitoring, and we'll direct your questions to speakers at the appropriate time. And you can also use the raise hand feature. I think Petra will make use of this in her presentation to kind of encourage a bit more interaction too. And we'll aim to leave a few minutes after each presentation for questions and some time at the end as well. And I just want to highlight that we really would like to make this as interactive as possible, so please do share your experiences. Okay, let me just move on to the session outline now. Oh, great. So first, our speakers are going to share their thoughts on defining learning and some of the challenges we face with capturing and producing learnings. Then Petra is going to share a presentation on learning design. Then Katherine will talk about some points to think about when you're disseminating learning outputs. And finally, we'll have 10 or so minutes at the end for questions and answers. So we all know that capturing learning from our current and previous program activities is really important and can help us avoid making the same mistakes, but we don't always know how to share our learnings in the best way so that they can reach and benefit other practitioners. Our aim for today's session is to get thinking about what makes a good learning and share some really practical tools, tips, and strategies for you to take away and apply. So when you're designing learning outputs, they can be relevant, accessible, engaging, and can help improve your own and others' programming. So let's get started by hearing from our speakers. I'll begin by putting a question to Katherine. So Katherine, could you share your thoughts on how you would define learning and what you think makes a good learning?
Thanks very much, Darja. So I think for me, in its most simple terms, learning is the process of taking the wealth of information we generate in our programs and every day during our work, analysing it so that we can understand what's happened, what's going well, what's not going so well, and then translating that into kind of lessons or recommendations, which can be used to elicit a change in our behaviour and ultimately to improve our programming. I think here that's what we do, that's what we think about when we think about learning, is making our programming better and improving things. And as somebody, like, I work a lot with knowledge and information management, so when I think about learning in more practical terms, effective learning really hinges on the products we use to transmit these and deliver this analysis and these recommendations, because I think it needs to be easily digestible to those who need it the most. So I think, to answer the second part about what makes a good learning, it's really taking the time to consider the purpose of a learning piece and who your audience is going to be while you're designing it, and then really taking the time to think about the best way to deliver that information to them. Because if we don't manage to translate those recommendations, which, you know, it takes us time to come up with those and resource, if we don't manage to translate that into action, then it sort of loses the overall purpose of the activity. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thanks. Very insightful. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to Petra. And Petra, could you answer the second question? So, which is, what are the main challenges that we as practitioners face with generating and disseminating learning?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. I think we do generate the learning. We don't have that much problem to generate it, because we all learn from our programs. We all learn from our mistakes, but I think we often forget to capture it and to disseminate it and to give it to our colleagues, to fellows, to other humanitarian practitioners. And I think why we struggle to capture it, it's because we often finish the program and we are happy to finish it and to start a new one. We often change the teams at that moment. When we are working abroad, there might be changes. So then, like, the line is kind of cut, and we don't capture it. We don't write down all the best practices and recommendation and lesson learned. And if we do so, sometimes then we struggle with dissemination, because new people are on board. They don't find these lessons learned. They don't understand them. It's not where, maybe sometimes it's not very digestibly written or passed on. Yeah. In the same time, I think if we manage also to generate and disseminate and so on, we often struggle also with the time, because how many of you already have been in the situation where you prepare a great learning, you were really sure that the learning is great, you were ready to disseminate it to your fellows, but then it wasn't not good timing, because we had to start something else. There was something more urgent. Yeah, I think this is these are the most difficulties that we have when we are generating and disseminating learning.
Perfect. Thank you, Petra. Thank you both for your answers. And I think you've raised some really interesting points around about accessibility and relevance, and also prioritizing learning and the struggles and difficulties we face with that. I would ask everybody as well, if you'd like to, you can please contribute and share your own answers to these questions in the chat, and we can come back to these later in the session. Now I'm going to hand over to Petra for her presentation. So she'll be talking about what learning is on a conceptual level to begin with, and then looking at kind of 7 concrete steps to take into account when you are planning learning. Okay, so over to you, Petra. Oh, let me just say, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that Petra can share her presentation. Okay, Petra, hello. I can't hear you at the moment. I don't know if anybody else can hear. I can see your screen, but I can't hear you.
Very good. Now I think you should.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, this mute button is making some problems for me. Anyway, so As I presented myself, my name is Petra Pojerovà. I'm working for the Humanitarian Leadership Academy, which is an organization based in the UK, but also in several countries all over the world. And we are working to enable humanitarian practitioners to cope with the crisis in their own countries. And we do so by learning. And my role in this organization is learning design. So I am helping to design, or I'm helping to the others, to our partners, how to design quality learning. So I'll be just. So I would like to also know you, and I would like to know what are your experience with learning and with learning intervention. But I know that there is no time to really go around and present each other. I have a question for you, and the question is: have you ever designed any kind of learning intervention? And if yes, please can you raise your hand in the Zoom, and you can do so by seeing the participants, and there is a small button raise hand, so you can. I can see already some of you. Amazing. Okay. Thank you very much. I see that there is already some people who have the experience with designing learning intervention, maybe as a face-to-face training, maybe some kind of webinar as we are doing at the moment. So I hope I'm not going to repeat something that you already know. Please, if I do so, shout and ask me some other questions. And now I will continue in my presentation. So what I'm going to cover in this presentation, I will cover the first two questions of this webinar. This webinar aims at answering you these three questions: what is a learning, and what makes a good learning? How can I design an effective learning? And how can I effectively disseminate learnings to my audience? I'm going to talk only about the first two. The third one will be covered later on by Katherine. So the first question: what is a learning and what makes it a good learning? To me, it's about behavior change. I think we are designing learning to change something, and usually what we can change and what we're trying to change is the behavior of people, of our learners. We don't want only our learners to know, for example, imagine we are delivering a training for mothers on breastfeeding, on the importance of breastfeeding. We don't want this mother to only know that breastfeeding is good for health and for their child, but what we want is to internalize this learning and really teach them, or make this information part of their unconscious decision making. So once they are in the situation, they really react and they behave as we intended to. So you can see on my presentation, I'm going to talk about the FOC model on behavior change. And the behavior change can happen only if there are three elements. The first element is a trigger. The trigger means that I'm prompt to do it. For example, if I'm the mother at this training on breastfeeding, I received the training from an NGO about the importance of the breastfeeding. This is my trigger. The second element is motivation. So I want to do it. I understand the importance of the best breastfeeding, and I want my child to be healthy. And the third element is the ability. I'm able to do it. But for example, I'm working all day long in the field, and my child is guarded by by the grandmother. So there's something wrong, you know. If one of these three things doesn't work, we may fail in changing the behavior,
very dynamic,
which usually is the ability. Usually in the learning, we try to focus on the trigger, we focus on the motivation, and we focus on the ability. We try to enhance skills and enable people to do it, but sometimes we forget about other about other obstacles that learning can't resolve that easily. For example, lack of resources, lack of long-term support from influencers, etc. This doesn't mean learning should stop there, but I think we should recognize its limits and work with others to spot them and overcome these limits.
Yes, and we might actually do the first one.
Learning also is about building bridges, and it's about bridging learning gaps. We as a learning designer, or if then you are going to facilitate the learning, so facilitators, we build bridges between learners' current situation, where they are at the moment, and the situation where we would like them to be, so where they need to be. And there are several types of learning gaps. And I would like to ask you, what kind of learning gaps can you think of? Please use the chat box for your answer. I see. Okay, I can already see several answers. Communication barriers, complex messaging, language, connectivity, poor strategy. Okay. Integration and collaboration, irrelevant material to learners. Okay. Thank you very much. I think we all know there are several gaps and learning gaps that we encounter, and I will talk about the four that I recognized. The first one is knowledge. So maybe you tackle this in materials that are irrelevant, or like knowledge that is missing. Learners use knowledge and information to meet their learning needs, but information alone isn't enough to address a learning need. And learners need to know how and when to use this information, this knowledge.
Yeah.
The second barrier that I identified is the skills. This is very much in connection with the ability from the previous model that I talked to you about. Learners need to apply what they know in real situation, test their knowledge and test their understanding, ask questions and figure things out for the learning to have real impact. And to master a skill, learner almost always need to practice their skill and many times. Another gap that we have, it's a motivation. Learner need knowledge and skills to overcome their challenges, but they also need to desire and motivation to put it into the practice. So even though they can know and they know what and how, if they are not motivated, there's not going to be any change. And the fourth gap that I identify as a habit gap. So having the knowledge, skills, and motivation is still not enough to overcome an obstacle. Often learners need to develop a habit to make an effective long-term change. Learners need to put what they have learned into use regularly to form a habit.
I mean, if you have time.
We as a learning designers, we have to also think how this process is going to be, how to come from the point A to point B, and it usually goes from by a learning process. You can see a learning process as it was described by Cobb, and it's experiential learning cycle. People need to experience something, they need to reflect afterwards on it, they draw some conclusions. Once they draw the conclusion, they need to apply it, and once they are applying it, they are actually experiencing it again, and there is a circle coming again and again. Maybe if you want, I can present you an example of Anne. So, for example, Anne is experiencing it, and Anne collects water from the local river and uses it to drink, prepare food, and wash. However, the community's water supply makes people sick. So she's experiencing something. She also reflects. She reflects and think about this and asks a local community worker to show how to make the water clean. A community worker visits Anne and explains that boiling the water will make it safe to drink, because boiling the water kills the bacteria in it. Then she concludes. She thinks about it and decides making the water clean by boiling. It is an easy process for helping protect her family from disease. She's really motivated. And then application come. The community worker and Anne practice boiling the water together, and the worker points out ways to make sure it's safe. Anne begins to routinely boil the family's water. Each time she does it, she has a new experience. It may start a new learning cycle. So it can be, again, a new experience. She can newly reflect on it. She can conclude new things on how to boil the water the best, and she can apply it again. So I hope until now I covered the first question on what is learning, at least for what is learning, how I understand it, and how to make a good learning. Now I would like to tackle the second question: how can I design, or how can you design, an effective learning? And I have another question for you. When we speak about effective learning, what an effective learning means for you? And please, if you can, use the chat box for your answers. I start doing the first answers. Thank you very much. So the learning should be practical, it should be relevant, it should be effective, it should be interactive and participatory, it should bring the change.
Yeah.
It should be easy to understand.
Yeah, that would be great, because it would just only increase the representativeness of the...
It should be involving everybody. Okay. Validate it. Okay, thank you very much for all your answer. I think we are also tackling here adult principles of learning. I'm not going to talk about this that much, but if you want later on, you can have a look at the Google and see what adult learning principles mean, and you will find out that you are actually saying this a lot in your answers. What I'm going to talk is, I think effective learning happens when learners emerge from the experience with new or improved capability to be able to do the things they need or want. And also the effective learning is when you actually achieve your learning objective, what you wanted as a learning designer. And your role in this is to plan and prepare the learning experience so that it's participatory, interactive, and so on.
And what do you think of trainees?
Creating the conditions for successful or effective learning can be really challenging because there are many factors that can influence the success. On the other hand, as learning designer, so when you are designing this learning, you have a lot of power and you can actually influence these conditions. So as I said, effective learning is the learning that fully achieves its learning objective. And effective design, and we usually speak about learning design, but also sometimes we speak about instructional design, makes acquisition of the knowledge, skills, etc. more effective, efficient, and appealing. And how can you practically do this? So one way to do it is to use instructional design model, and one of the model that is the most known and probably the most used in the community is ADDIE model. And I'm going to talk about this in the next slide. So here is the ADDIE model. ADDIE is the abbreviation of analyze, design, develop, implement, and evaluate. So these are the words, and these are the logical steps to follow a process so that you don't omit anything in your thinking about learning intervention. So in analysis, you analyze your goals, what you want to achieve by this learning, what kind of behavior change you want to achieve, what kind of objective you have, who is your target audience, what are their needs, what are their knowledge, existing knowledge, what are their constraints, what is their learning environment, what kind of delivery you can use. Can it be online? Can it be offline? Should it be offline and face-to-face? These all questions you should answer in the first phase. Design is the second phase. In the design, you organize your training, you plan your activities, you outline. If you are going to do, for example, a learning that is online, you can outline your graphics, your media, and so on. The development stage is about putting it into action. You work on your materials, you develop your activities that you decided you are going to do, and so on. Next stage is implementation. You put it really into practice, you implement it, you run it, and you facilitate it, and so on. The fifth stage, evaluation, you reflect on how it went, how it goes. You measure the result, you try to gather the feedback, and you use it again for the next time to reiterate and to make your learning intervention better next time. And as I think for effective learning, the first phase is crucial.
What was the name of the consortium again?
So the analyze is very crucial. You can't omit it, and you shouldn't omit. In the same time, I very often think we do omit it because we think it's a waste of time. And yes, I admit that this phase is very long or can be very long, and maybe can seem redundant, but without a good analysis of who you are designing this learning for, you can't really achieve your goal. So I prepared for you several steps what to do your analysis well. I think the first, you should start with defining your overall goal and learning needs. What do you want to achieve? Why you are doing this learning? What are the needs of your learners or of your organization, of your program team, etc. The second step I would suggest is really learn something about your target audience. Write it down, define who they are, how they learn the best. Do they know the language? Do they struggle with the language you are intending to do this learning? do they have the connectivity? Can you do it online, etc., etc.? There are a lot of questions that you should be able to you should ask and answer about your target audience. Then decide what should be the target audience learning pathway. So this is not only like how they're going to go through the learning and when, but also what is the methodology that you would suggest, what kind of delivery you would suggest for your target audience. Then define your learning objective. It might be, you might think it's the same as your overall goal, but I would suggest it's not the same. Learning objective to me are how do you want to achieve your overall goal by learning. So you define what kind of information your target audience should know, should understand, what they should be able to apply, and so on. Then you tweak these learning objectives to expected outcomes, and the expected outcomes is like what the learner will be able to do, know, and feel after the learning intervention. And if you write it down already here, it can really help you afterwards with dissemination of the learning, because it can make a very nice information for learners. What will they get from the learning that you are going to deliver? The sixth step is choose the content. Choose the content that is only the content that is really relevant for your learning objectives and outcomes. Organize it into a logical sequence. And then fifth, it's always good to list your available resources and materials that can help you afterwards in the design. And we are coming back to the ADI. So I was talking about analysis, but there are several other steps that you have to go through so that your learning is effective. But everything really follows analysis. I don't think you can omit it. And I can't really talk about the design at the moment without having the analysis, because design will be quite different for face-to-face training, and it will be quite different for a webinar. It can be quite different for a manual. If you're going to just design a manual, it's a bit different. So I suggest you go well through the analysis, and I prepared for you a checklist that I can then later on share via Darja, who is hosting this webinar. You can try and do it for yourself. This is the end of my presentation. I thank you very much. If you want to learn more, please visit the webpage of Humanitarian Leadership Academy, and especially we have on our online platform learning design and facilitation. There are two. One is a basic level or introductory level, and the other one is more advanced. So if you want to learn more, you can go ahead and learn. So thank you very much, and now I will hand the word back to Darja and Katherine.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Petra. Some really, really interesting models and tips that we can use. And thank you, everybody, for your interaction. It's great to see so many of you participating as well. And as Petra mentioned, we will definitely make this presentation and the checklist that she's sharing available, as well as this webinar recording and everything. I just want to go back to the questions we asked earlier about how you define learning. So we had some answers, and one person said that learning is anything someone can link to, remember, and understand. And a second answer was learning is a process of acquiring knowledge, acquiring knowledge through experience, study, and practice. So thank you very much for those. We have a couple of minutes for questions if Petra wants to take them. If anybody has any questions, you can type them in the chat. I'll leave you a couple of minutes to do that. Otherwise, we'll move on to Katherine's presentation. We'll also have time for questions in the end, so if you are still thinking about any questions you want to ask, we can come back to those. Okay. Let me just share my screen. Maybe Petra, if you could stop sharing your, well, actually I can.
Yes.
Yes, perfect. And I will share my screen when I get to my presentation. Thank you. Here we go. So we're going to move over to Katherine, who will be talking about some points and tips to think about when you are disseminating your learning. So this is a nice lead on from what Petra has been talking about.
Thanks very much, and thanks Petra for that presentation. It was really interesting. I really particularly appreciated that model you had at the end and the stressing how important analysing is. And I think as we move through this section on disseminating learnings, I think a lot of people will see that there's some parallels there on some of the things you need to be thinking about right from the outset when you consider disseminating your learning. So thanks for sharing that. So I'm just going to be taking a little bit of time to quickly go through, I think it's 7 points, on different things you need to think about when disseminating learning, and to highlight the things you need to consider when you're just preparing yourself to do this. So the first one is considering your dissemination strategy when you're planning and producing your learning outputs. And I think this links back a lot to what we've been talking about already. So it's really, really important to think about the objective and the purpose of the dissemination before you even begin producing your learning output, because you really want to make sure that your objectives are really clear and your messages are tailored to the right audience. And that needs to be thought of right from the beginning. So if I can use an example of taking a public health project in Senegal, you want to produce a learning piece, maybe a case study on collaborating with the health ministry. So before you begin producing this piece and doing your interviews, you need to think about who you're going to share it with. Is the purpose of the piece to be shared with other practitioners in country? Is it for the region? Are you producing it to go to donors? Will you be presenting it at a conference? Why do you want to share this learning? And thinking about all that at the beginning will really help you come back to the type of learning you need to produce in order to deliver those things. So I think that's really important. The second point I want to talk about is reviewing your past dissemination efforts. So as organizations, we produce learnings very regularly and we produce a lot of them. And I think it's really important to draw on previous experience either in your department or with peers in the organization or indeed in other organizations. And that can be a really good initial exercise before creating a new plan yourself. We don't want to be reinventing the wheel. So how did you disseminate your information in the past? What did work? What didn't work? How did your target audience respond? You know, what are the platforms that they're using? And did you target those correctly last time? And what's the nature of the feedback you received? And all this information you can gather from answering these questions can help influence what you decide to do and to create something really useful this time. So I'd be really interested to hear from you guys if you have any examples of successful dissemination strategies that you or one of your colleagues have done recently. And why not share in the chat what your dissemination plan was and why it worked. And I'll come back to it a little bit later and see if we've got any really good examples that we can learn from each other here. So the third point I want to touch on is, again, coming back to establishing the purpose and objectives of this dissemination. So you really have to think about not just the audience and why you're producing the learning, but sort of why you're disseminating it and what the purpose of that is. So perhaps you want to share it with as many people as possible so you can inform their practice. Perhaps you want to use it as an advocacy piece. And actually, I think when we think about dissemination, there are three main purposes or layers to this. The first one being raising awareness. So you might be producing a piece where you're trying to shine light on a particular issue or on your project in specifically. The second, I would say, after raising awareness would be increasing understanding. So if you're looking at a specific project, you might want to understand why that project's been so effective, or perhaps you might not have been able to meet one of your objectives specifically. And I would say the third is to inspire action. As we've been talking about, learning is really about creating a change in our behavior and helping improve programs. So the real purpose of the learning piece might be to inspire this action. And I think when we talk about learning in our organizations, it's really these last 2 points, the increasing understanding and inspiring action, that we tend to do most on a day-to-day basis. And like I said, it's really that last point that Petra's highlighted. So it's really good to hear that from her. On the fourth point is identifying your target audience. It's really, really, really key that you think about who your learning is going to be aimed at. And it's important to know how this audience absorbs learning and information, and what their needs are. You really want to think about the kind of channels that they're using, and what their timelines are. Are they people who are extremely busy and have a lot of time, and don't have a lot of time, so you want to really condense down your learning for your audience? Or are they the kind of people who are maybe research focused and really enjoy getting into the detail and the nitty-gritty of a learning piece and might have time to read a longer report? And what are they going to use the learning for at the end? Because that will also depend how you deliver it. So if we go back to this example of public health project in Senegal, and you want to disseminate your learning, say, to practitioners who are working on similar projects, but you also have to disseminate the learning to your donors as part of the program funding. And these two audiences, if we think about those, will have very different needs and be using very different channels to absorb that learning. So the practitioners may wish to use the learning to inform them on how to build relationships, perhaps with the donor themselves. Whereas the donors may want to use the information to look at your program, evaluate how it's gone, and to inform their own future programming. And you can find out the different needs of those audiences by researching what they've been receptive to in the past, by asking them. And I'll come back to this when I talk about feedback later on. Another separate example of this is if you think about if you're targeting an audience which is much younger, you might want to use less traditional dissemination strategies. You might want to consider some sort of interactive or online platform, perhaps a website that's got a lot of graphics and interfaces that they can get involved with, or social media is a very common one with trying to communicate with younger audiences. So I think it's really important to think about those things. So the next is about developing key messages. And I think you really want to make sure that you highlight the key points in a learning and that you're sharing and that your messaging is really effective. So it's not just about a summary of the results, but it really explains what they mean and ideally the exact action that needs to be taken. And these messages need to be very clear and simple and action orientated, as I've said. So if you've identified several audiences, as we were talking about in the previous stage, you really need to make sure that you're tailoring this to each one, because the actions that one audience take might be quite different from another. And it may be that when you're thinking about your dissemination strategy, you need to produce two separate summaries or graphics, each for a different audience with a different focus. So perhaps, if we go back to the same example of a public health strategy in Senegal, and if you think about your primary audience as being the other practitioners, and that they would want to learn, and the learning you want to share with them is about how to collaborate effectively with the health ministry, as we were saying. So the audience don't want to hear lots of background about the health ministry and what they do, because they probably already know that. They're probably already thinking about working them or already working with them. So in any kind of summary, that's not the kind of detail that they'd be looking for. But what would benefit them would be practical tips and action points. Sort of the processes they can implement to pursue this collaboration, what worked really well for you, what didn't work so well and what you had to adapt in your programming, and what they should absolutely avoid doing. And it should be clear and as succinct as possible. I'd next like to go on to identifying resources, tools and channels. And I think this is, as I said earlier, I do knowledge and information management. And I think this is really, really important to me, is making sure you pick the right tools and channels for disseminating your learning. And this will really depend on the kind of budget you have and, again, your target audience, because dissemination can be a very expensive and time-consuming process. So it's really important to think about it creatively and make sure that you're using those resources in the most effective way, because there are lots and lots of channels that you can use. In the interest of time, I'm only going to go through a few, but particularly as we go through talking about platforms, I'd really love it if you could share in the chat any online platforms that I don't mention that you've used in the past, and that you found particularly effective for getting your learnings out there, because I think this is the kind of space where it's great for us to share those things. The first thing I think is important to think about is online platforms, because they can really quickly expand your audience and readership. particularly your secondary audience. And most online platforms are free, or they're free for members if you sign up, which is great, obviously, when we're talking about having limited resources and how best to make use of those. And of course, you're saving on printing costs because you're not having to print hundreds of copies of a report or of a learning and then post those and get those to the right people. So that's another great cost-saving economy there as well. And of course, you can also upload onto your organization's website. You can use websites like Prevention Web or ALNAP or the Disaster Preparedness Learning Platform, and particularly things like the Learning Platform. If you know that there are practitioners using the same kind of website all the time, and all of the learnings that are going up there are really sort of sector driven, or a specific thematic area, that's a really great place to be uploading your learning, because you know that the audience is already interested in what's going up. So like I said, those are just a couple of platforms, so I'd be really interested for you to share any others that you've used in the past in the chat. The second thing to think about with tools and channels is about printing creatively. I think there is definitely value to printing hard copies of annual reports or evaluations of certain learnings, but I think it's important nowadays that we really think, do we need to print this 70-page report, or would printing a summary be a better use of resource? If we create something that's quite graphical and very easy to interact with and can be read very quickly, perhaps that's going to be more useful to our audience than the full report itself. So I think it's really important we think about that. We could also organise learning events and conferences, because these are super effective ways of disseminating and sharing learnings. It's a place where you often get practitioners together who all have common interests and common sectors that they're working in, but they can be extremely expensive to host and organise. There's definitely an advantage to being in person and being able to talk through ideas and share learnings and share the documents and the summaries that we've produced. Particularly when it comes to inspiring action, it can be a really good place to help do this and create collaborative environments for this. Webinars are an alternative to this, of course, as we're doing today. If it's not possible to get people together in person, then you can organise an online space or community for people to do that. And it can be a really good place to share our learnings without having to incur the cost of hiring a venue and food and hotels, etc. And now, something I mentioned a little bit earlier on as the last point in this, I want to talk about feedback loops just quickly, because part of the value of producing the learning is being able to share it with a wider community and together to achieve an outcome that you're all working towards and to learn from that learning piece. But it's important to think about how stakeholders can get in touch with you once you've shared that, in case they want to provide comments or additional ideas, or to ask you further questions about specifics to do with the piece that haven't been included. And it could be as simple as putting an email address down for a contact person, or if it's an online thing, having a link there that they can just put something in a chat. But I think it's really important to think about this, because part of the learning cycle is not just putting the piece out there and letting it just sit there. It's all about talking to each other, building on the ideas, trying to put it into practical and actionable tasks. So I think creating some kind of feedback mechanism there when you're disseminating learning is really, really important. And the last part I want to talk about is evaluating your dissemination efforts. And this is just so crucial when we're talking about dissemination. And when it's well done, it can really, really help us go back to that second point I mentioned about thinking about what you've done in the past. If you've managed to evaluate a dissemination plan at the end, you've already got that sort of resource there available to you when you plan your next dissemination strategy. And when you're doing this, you really want to think about which messages and channels and activities have worked really well and which ones haven't. Did you have any surprises that you weren't expecting while disseminating? An area where it just, all of a sudden there was a real sort of momentum behind the sharing of your learning, and you really just weren't expecting that, and that's something worth highlighting. Make sure when you're doing this, of course, that you select measurable criteria, and if possible, focus less on your efforts and more on the outcome. So, it's really about seeing what did work, what got our message out there, and if you can, any kind of actions that came from that. And the last thing, which I haven't put on this slide, but I just want to quickly talk about, is uptake. We don't really have time to go into this today, but I think we've really touched on the whole purpose of sharing the learning is so that it's applied, and a big part of that is uptake. And measuring uptake can be really, really challenging. So we'd love to hear from you, any thoughts or comments you have about uptake. But unfortunately, we don't have time to go into we think that might be a whole different webinar. So if people are interested in talking about uptake, then perhaps we can set up something on the learning platform, a forum discussion or something. So just write anything in the chat you have that you're thinking about that. So yeah, with that, I'd like to close. Thanks very much for listening. And yeah, that's it.
Great, thank you so much, Katherine. There's some really practical and really useful tips to bear in mind when you're thinking about how to disseminate your learning and make sure that it reaches the right people. Because you invest a lot of time, as Katherine mentioned, into producing these learnings, and it's really good that they are read and they are shared as widely as possible. I think we have a bit of time now for questions and answers. So let me just have a look in the chat and see if we've had any questions. I'm also going to stop sharing my screen for now. Let me have a look. Any questions? Let's have a look. Okay. If any, I think Katherine used the public health project in Senegal just as an example, but if there are any, we're not looking at a real project, but if there is anybody who is working in this kind of field and has a similar example, we would be really happy to share that. And also just wanted to say there's one question. Do you have any way for evaluation? So we've produced, there are a couple of webinars. One we haven't looked at evaluation specifically, but we had one earlier in the series on producing case studies and another one on lessons papers. So I think if you're interested in that, you can have a look at those. And I think it's important, I wanted to highlight as well, that on the learning platform, there is a section of tools and guidance that hosts a lot of tools on producing different types of learning. So I want to point you to that and say you can explore, there's things on case studies, blog posts, producing videos, and other media you can use to share your learnings.
And if I can just add to that question on evaluations, I know here at Action Against Hunger, we share our evaluations on ALNAP website as well as our own website. So that goes, and we found that to be very effective. So that goes back to sort of thinking through the best way to disseminate your learning, and you're taking the time to really produce these really in-depth reports, and those are the platforms that we found most useful. So if that helps you, that's great.
Great, we have a question. How can we know the impact of disseminating? Who would like to take that? Katherine or Petra?
Yeah, I think from my end that's a really, really tricky one. I think it depends on the platform you're using for your dissemination. And I think on the one hand, you can measure sort of how many people you think you've managed to reach with that. So if you're sharing on an online platform, a lot of the time you can get information about download rates or click rates or sort of the amount of people visiting a website. But so far as measuring the impact of that, sort of how that's taken into from the recommendations and the learning itself into actionable sort of like activities that are actually being carried out, I think that's really difficult to do. And I think if that's important to you as part of the production of a learning, then that really needs to come right back to that design phase at the beginning. So if measuring the impact of that learning is something that's very important or sort of intrinsic to the activity itself, then that needs to be considered right at the start. So who are you going to be disseminating it to? What are you hoping that they'll do with it? And how could you measure whether or not they've done that? Would it be distributing a survey to them afterwards and seeing if they've managed to action anything? Is actioning, is it even going to be possible to measure those actions, or is it more about behavior change or attitudes and perceptions? So I think that's a really, really interesting question about measuring that impact. And I think, that's something that could definitely be discussed in a forum group. If you have a specific example, it'd be great to chat through that with you. But yeah, good question. Thank you.
Thanks, Katherine. And we had another comment earlier, which I think we missed, And that's from Shituma, I think. Disseminating learning from community members to the community often helps dissemination. So I guess this goes back to what Katherine mentioned earlier about the audience and the purpose of your dissemination and the type of learning that you're disseminating. But thank you so much. Petra, do you have any comments on that? Oh, there's another comment. Oh, sorry,
yeah, I think Katherine answered very well, so I don't have anything to comment on. It's exactly what she said.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and there's another question here. Someone would like to know more about learning pathways. So Petra, perhaps this is something you could share and we can make available as a resource in addition to the presentation. Maybe some more tips or resources around learning pathways. Would that be possible?
Yes, if you mean by the learning pathway, the learning design and facilitation online courses that I shared, I will share my presentation with you, and there will be the links. But yeah, if it's better to put the links into the email, then we can do this also.
Okay, excellent, thank you. And then we have, okay, I think we have time for these two questions. So one from Blandina. So when you disseminate learning, for example, on social media, you get negative feedback or the learning may elicit negative comments. Is this a good thing? For me?
Well, I can do it. I think any feedback and any comments should always be thought of as constructive and useful. I guess if they've been delivered negatively, that's one thing, but I think we all have to be brave and sort of dissect, you know, what's the message in there in that negative comment or negative feedback, and think about how we can best apply that and how it contributes to what you're saying. So yes, I think it is a good thing, and I think sometimes any kind of constructive feedback we get from people or comments which, you know, perhaps somebody's saying, oh, that's not what I've found in the past, or that contradicts my experience. Actually, some of that can be the most interesting feedback we get, because it can really help us question what we've learned, identify if there's maybe areas we didn't look into enough, or perhaps something that, you know, we should take the time to review more. Or maybe it's just saying that in different contexts, things are different, and that in itself is really interesting. So yeah, I think it's a really good thing. But I think, of course, you hope that those will be delivered constructively as opposed to negatively.
Yeah. Thank you. And somebody left a comment on cultural sensitivity and being aware of that when we're disseminating learnings. And yeah, that's a really, really good point. So we have to bear in mind that the way that we relay the learnings as well. Okay, so I'm conscious of time and that we only have a couple of minutes left. So what I propose, there's a comment here back to Katherine's comment. The negative feedback could be because this person might not be the target audience. Yeah, that is definitely a possibility. Absolutely. That could be happening. What I propose is we can take some of these questions and move them onto the forum discussions on the learning platform, and we will share these with you, and it will be great to continue the conversation on there. So I think it's time to wrap up, and I want to thank both of our speakers, Petra and Katherine. Thank you so much for your input into the session and the insights that you provided. And thank you to all our participants as well for your contributions and for making this a really interactive session. As I mentioned, the recording and the presentations for this session will be made available in our learning library very shortly, I think towards the end of the week. And we'll provide, today, okay, my colleague mentioned, and we'll provide all the links that we referenced and all the tools that we referenced as part of that. We'll be back at the same time next week, and I'll be hosting again, and the topic will be preparedness and emergency response systems. And we'll be joined by 3 speakers, one from the Philippines, one from Pakistan, and one from Kenya, to discuss initiatives that are strengthening local and national preparedness. And the week after that, we'll be looking at the localization of learning. So looking specifically at key enablers and blockers of capturing and sharing learning at the local level. And that will be a really nice lead on from today's session. So we hope that you'll join us again for both of those. If you have any questions at any time, feel free to get in touch. The email is deplearning@actionagainsthunger.org.uk. And yeah, as I said, we hope to see you back here again soon. Thank you everyone very much for your participation today. Okay. And thank you, Petra and Katherine.
Thanks very much.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.